friends to my course on carbon footprint, carbon budget, and climate justice. So, in this lecture, I would deal with the concept of what is known as carbon footprint and what is known as global warming potential (GWP). So, in this small video, you would understand what do you mean by carbon footprint and what do you mean by global warming potential. You'd also get to know how to look at the data which is published at the world level and how to interpret that data from the perspective which I would be talking about. Uh, Carbon footprint is a nice idea, nice concept in a way, capture the impact of climate change. You all know that climate change is because of greenhouse gases, but simply talking about the gases like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, fluorocarbons, which cause climate change in an abstract manner is no good. So we need to quantify it. So quantification of the emissions and especially quantification of the emissions from an individual perspective, from the perspective of a nation and from a global perspective would be relevant if you want to change, make an impact or intervene in the debate of climate change. So carbon footprint is a nice idea of capturing this. It is basically the amount of greenhouse gases which are generated by the human beings and which contribute to the climate change. So as an individual, we do contribute to emissions, so that becomes an individual carbon footprint. As a nation, we do contribute to climate change by emitting, and that becomes the carbon footprint of that nation. Right? This is the way we look at it. As a group of countries also, as a developed world, would have a certain carbon footprint. China would have a certain carbon footprint. India would have a certain carbon footprint. United States of America would have a certain climate footprint. European Union, the group of countries of Europe, would have a certain carbon footprint. Okay, so that's this way. If you look at the things, then that the issue of climate change becomes more clear to us. So this is the way carbon footprint has to be looked into. It has a climate change connection, but this climate change connection is complex and a lot is being researched upon at a global level about this impact of greenhouse gas emissions on climate change. So as I said, it basically carbon footprint idea is an attempt to quantify this emissions and make sure that this is reduced and the impact on the environment is thereby mitigated. We all know that the greenhouse gas emissions GHG, okay, these are the gases which are emitted by human beings in their production cycle and consumption cycle. So the gases are mostly from carbon dioxide, the result of fossil fuel consumption. It is also methane, which is generally from agriculture, the nitrous oxide, and freons. Okay, all these gases, they trap the heat, and this is known as greenhouse gas effect, and that is what has to be captured by the concept of carbon footprint. So the global warming potential is an interesting idea about capturing the impact of the different gases, because you know that as I said, carbon dioxide is one greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide is other greenhouse gas, methane is the third greenhouse gas, and so on. All these gases would not contribute to global warming in a similar manner. Okay, the way they contribute has to be understood. So they are contributing to global warming in a different manner, and because there is a difference, okay, and that difference depends on the ability to absorb the energy and the lifespan of the gases. We need to have a term, and that term is global warming potential, GWP. So GWP or global warming potential is an interesting concept, interesting way of looking at the different gases which cause emissions. So the global warming potential idea was developed to allow the comparisons of global warming and to capture the impacts of different gases. It is the way of how much warming the gas will cause in a certain period. You have to define certain period. Let us say 100 years. In 100 years, how much warming a particular gas would cause relative to the warming impact of carbon dioxide. Now, why carbon dioxide? Because carbon dioxide is a major greenhouse gas, and we will have to have certain base gas. So, base gas for capturing the global warming potential is a carbon dioxide gas, and then other gases are accordingly compared with CO2. So, the global warming potential of carbon dioxide is taken as 1, and then for other gases we make a comparison. For example, the CO2, so the global warming potential of methane is 28. Now, what does this mean? It means that 1 kg of methane emission would equal to the warming potential of 28 kgs of carbon dioxide. That is the meaning. Global warming potential of methane is 28 means what? It means that 1 kg of methane emission will warm the planet, okay, 28 times that of carbon dioxide, right? So, methane has a global warming potential of 28. Okay, so in other terms, we can say that 1 ton of CO2, okay, 1 ton of methane would be equal to 28 tons of CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent. So, this is an interesting manner of looking at the carbon footprint. So, carbon footprint of methane is 28 times that of carbon dioxide. Okay, I hope this idea is very clear to you now. So, if you look at the data, you would find that, as I mentioned, the CO2 has a global warming potential of 1, and methane has a global warming potential of 28. Nitrous oxide has a global warming potential of 265. It means that it has a global warming potential 265 times that of CO2. Okay, lifespan is different. The lifespan of carbon dioxide, that is its warming potential, is 150 years. It would stay in that atmosphere. Methane, once emitted, it would stay in the atmosphere for only 15 years. After 15th year, it would not no longer impact the climate. Okay, nitrous oxide, the lifespan is 120 years. So, this is so these are the two important parameters. One is the lifespan, and other is the warming potential we need to look into when we look at the climate data. Now, overall, if you want to get an overall picture of how much the greenhouse gas contributed to the climate change, carbon dioxide is the most important polluter. Carbon dioxide contributes to 76% of the greenhouse gas effect. Whereas, in spite of the fact that the global warming potential of methane is 28, its contribution is only 16%. And in spite of the fact that nitrous oxide's global warming potential is 265, its contribution to greenhouse gas effect is only 6%. Okay, so it means that carbon dioxide remains the major gas, okay, major emitter which is contributing to climate change, and we need to look into climate change. If you want to stop climate change, okay, or you need to mitigate climate change, then we need to make sure that carbon dioxide emissions are reduced. Okay, so these figures are just for illustration purposes only, but it gives you a fairly good idea about the concept that what is global warming potential and how this global warming potential is important to study from the perspective of different gases. Okay, so carbon dioxide contributes in a big way, followed by methane. Another way of looking at carbon footprint is we can calculate the carbon footprint per family. Okay, per family, and this I had explained in much detail in my course on learn how to calculate carbon footprint, but it is very easy idea. So what we do is that we take the fossil fuel consumed by a particular family, and then we multiply that fossil fuel consumed with the emission factor. Okay, for example, if a family consumes certain kgs of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, for cooking, and if we know the emission factor for LPG, we can calculate the carbon footprint which has gone in cooking activity of that family. Similarly, if the family is consuming certain electricity, and if we know the emission factor of electricity in that area, then we can calculate the carbon footprint for electricity. Similarly, if we know that a family is traveling by a diesel car, and if you know the carbon footprint of diesel or the emission factor of diesel per liter, and we know the mileage of the vehicle, the number of kilometers traveled, we can in a way calculate the carbon footprint which has gone in transporting that individual, okay, in his car travel. Okay, so this way we can total it up and we can calculate the carbon footprint of the family. Okay, so this way a carbon footprint of a family is arrived at. Similarly, we can look at the carbon footprint from the national level. Okay, say a nation, if you take a particular nation, say United States of America, how much energy is going into cooking as a nation, how much energy is going in the form of electricity, how much fuel is consumed in the car travel, okay, as a nation, right? All this we can total it up, multiply it with emission factor, and then get a gross data for that particular nation, right? So this is an interesting way of quantifying the emissions. Carbon footprint is an interesting way of quantifying the emissions, and you and me can do these calculations if we have the figure of emission factors. If you have the data of consumption of fossil fuels, you can easily do these calculations. Okay, now if you want to look at the data, then a way of looking at the data is how this carbon footprint differs with respect to different nations, and how this carbon footprint it differs with respect to the time period, right? So this data which I have shown you, it gives you an idea about how the carbon footprint changes with respect to the years. You would see that in 1850 the fossil fuel consumption was low, hence the carbon footprint was low. In 1991 the fossil fuel consumption jumped up because of industrialization, and the carbon footprint was 23 gigatons of CO2. In 2021, you look at this, the fossil fuel consumption has jumped from 23 billion tons to 37 billion tons, and there is a jump in the CO2 emissions, right? So this is another way of looking at the data, and this data you can get from the IPCC reports, okay, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Okay, so this we would be looking into more detail when we discuss the concept of climate justice. Another way of looking at it is how the carbon footprint it changes with different nations. Okay, so the carbon footprint of USA, for example, is 5.2 gigatons. That of China is 10.2 gigatons. That of European Union is 2.67 gigatons. Okay, so this is the data which you can easily obtain from internet, right? The contribution of United States as of now in 2021 in greenhouse gas effect is 14%. That of China is 28%, that of European Union is 8%. So these three nations, for example, United States, China, European Union, they together contribute to the carbon footprint or the climate change in a manner of equal to 50%. 50% is their contribution as of now in 2021, right? If you want to compare it with, say, another less industrialized country like Africa, okay, you would find that the carbon footprint of Africa is just 3%. Its emission is very low, 0.1 gigatons. Okay, so again, I had used the data as a comparison, Africa, China, and EU, European Union, and you'll find that the carbon footprint is much less for Africa as compared to China, as compared to European Union. Okay, so this way, the concept of carbon footprint and global warming potential aids you in comparing the data of different countries. Okay, and this way of looking at the data from a carbon footprint perspective, from the global warming perspective, would help us to talk about the much involved concepts like climate justice, which is an important part of our course. Okay, finally in this lecture I would show you this data which has been published by United Nations Environmental Program, which gives you how much is the absolute CO2 emissions of different nations. You'll find that China is ranking number 1 in the CO2 emissions. Its CO2 emission is closer to 13 gigatons of CO2 in around 2018 data. That of United States of America in the absolute basis is around 7 gigatons of CO2. India has around 4 to 5 gigatons of CO2 emission, right? Russia has less than 3 gigatons of CO2 emissions. So absolute basis one can look at the carbon footprint, okay, in gigatons of CO2 emissions. So this data again we can get the recent data and compare the different nations. A different way of looking at the data is on per capita basis. Per capita basis means per head. Okay, so we take the total emissions and divide it by the population. So that gives you per capita greenhouse gas emission or per capita carbon footprint. So if you look at from that perspective, you will find that the per capita CO2 emission for United States of America is much larger. It is around 20. That of Russia again is much larger. It is around 17 to 18. That of China is 9 per capita basis, but for India it is much less, like less than 3. Okay, so now if you look at the rankings, if you start ranking the countries, okay, on the basis of absolute basis, you will find a different set of countries is coming here. If you do it on the per capita basis, again a different set of countries is there, right? So why this happens, what it has to do with climate change, what it has to do with climate change negotiations, that we will understand in the next forthcoming lectures of mine. Okay, so I hope that you are enjoying this course. We would discuss the concept of carbon budgeting in the next class. Thanks, bye for now.